Hi, I'm Meredith Bell, the President of Performance Support Systems, and with me today is Dr. Mark Goulston. Mark, I'm so excited to have you with us.
I'm so excited to be here. Let me, wait, I want to get this thing to eye level. Okay, hold on. That might work better. Let's see. Okay, we'll try that. Okay, good. Yep.
I think you're good. But before we get started with our conversation, let me just tell our listeners a little bit about you. Mark is probably one of the most in-demand experts in the area of communication in the world today. He's advised not only leaders of the Fortune 500 company, he's also worked with leaders of some of the largest governments around the world. And his areas of specialty are varied. He's got quite a unique skill set. He, in addition to being the author of several books about communication, including the one we'll talk about today called Just Listen, he's also been a crisis psychiatrist for 30 years, and he has trained both the FBI and police around this whole topic of hostage negotiations. So, Mark, it's just amazing how prolific a writer you are with the number of books you've published, as well as the articles you have in print journals and online. And everything you've ever written that I've read is so on target and in such a conversational tone. I'm just tickled to have you here today to share your wisdom about the book that's one of my top favorite books that I've ever read. It's called Just Listen, Discover the Secret to Getting Through to Absolutely Anyone. That's quite a promise. And of course, I want to dive into some of the key concepts in the book, but first you have to tell us, what is that stop sign image behind you?
Well, I could promote my book. Here, if you're dyslexic, you might be able to see this.
No, it shows up correctly when you hold it up. I've got a copy right here too.
Well, there you go. Well, you have to get the paperback one because it's been revised. But so if I talk about Just Listen, I'm talking about me, and the stoplight is a signal for me to make sure that I focus on whoever I'm talking to, which is you and your audience. And a friend of mine named Marty Nemko is an NPR career host in San Francisco. If you look up Marty Nemko, Nemko, he's just so smart and so helpful. And when my book Just Listen came out, he said, Mark, for a guy who wrote a book on listening, you're lousy. And he told me about the stoplight rule, traffic light rule. And he said, when you're in conversation with people, you have 20 seconds for the green light to turn to yellow, and then they get a little fidgety because they didn't invite you to, use them as a sounding board or venting. And then you have another 20 seconds before the yellow light turns to red, and then you've really worn out your welcome, and you better be looking at them because you better take a hint because they'll be looking over your shoulder, they'll be looking at their watch. And the problem is you're feeling so good you won't even notice them. And that 40 seconds goes by in about 3 seconds. And if you want to find out more about it, I guess this is such a powerful concept that people talk too much. I blog all over the place, and I blog at Harvard Business Review. So if you look up HBR Goulston Talk Too Much, one of the blogs I wrote was How to Tell If You Talk Too Much. And that was the most popular of all my articles. I've probably written 25 articles. So if that speaks to you, you too should have a traffic light over your shoulder.
Well, or at least carry one in your head. And I can reinforce that with an appointment I had years and years ago as a consultant. I was meeting with the owner of a heating and air conditioning company. And I noticed even then, because I was very tuned into him, that whenever he was talking, he was highly engaged, leaning forward. As soon as I started saying anything, he starts looking at his watch. And I remember to this day, that was more than 20 years ago, but just becoming very conscious about asking questions to get him talking, because I knew it was not this kind of scenario where he was welcoming of information that I would share with him. So an important lesson to learn, I think, for all of us. And, as we get started, Mark, I was thinking of another story that I heard you share with one of our mutual friends, John Livesey, on his podcast. And we can talk about concepts and ideas from your book, which we will, but I don't think anything beats a story for really bringing home the point of what the impact can be when we listen well. So would you please share the story that you told on his show with that one CEO of a Fortune 500 company?
Yes, years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to this CEO, and I was going to interview him about success and performance, and I hadn't heard from him. And about a month later, I get a call from him as he's driving to the airport, and he's one of these people who's very earnest, very sincere, but would like to be cooler than he really is. So I pick up the phone, and he says, "Dr. L. Marco." And I go, "What?" And then he says who he is, and we'll call him Jack. And he says, "I don't know if you know." I said, "Of course I know who you are." And I said, "Dr. L." I said, "Dr. L. Jacko, what's going on?" And he said, I said I would get back to you, and I didn't. And that's not my style. So I'm just getting back to you to say that, yes, we'll schedule a time when we can meet. And I said, "Where are you going?" And he says, "Well, I'm going to Washington." And I said, "Is that family? Is that work?" He says, "It's both, but, mainly family." And then he talked about his mother having early or middle stages of Alzheimer's. And he described a very stoic and noble woman who, when she was aware of what she'd lost, she would be very down. She wouldn't complain about it because she was very stoic. But then when she wasn't aware of it, his father and his sister would just be beside themselves because they were seeing how this had ravished her mind. And so at that point, I said, "I have a direct order to give you." And he's on the phone. He says, "What?" I mean, this is little reporter journalist me and a Fortune 500 CEO. He said, "What?" I said, I have a direct order to give you. You give those." And I could see he was a little bit ticked. And I said, "When you get there, from what you've described, there's really no joy in your home. And so when she's aware of what she's lost, she's down. When they're aware of it, they're down. So what I'd like you to do, if she's aware of it, is to say to her the following, and it's using something from my book, Just Listen, called The Magic Paradox. And it's a way of sharing where the other person might be coming from in an ironic way. So what I suggested he say to her is, "Mom, I'll bet you sometimes feel that nobody knows what it's like for you to wish it was just over." And, you're not using the D word, the dead word. And the point is, if she picks that up, she'll start to tear up and she'll lighten. And then if she does that, follow it up with, "And I'll bet you sometimes feel that you can't keep doing this much more. Isn't that true?" And I said, if both those work, what'll happen is she'll cry, but you will have given her relief. She's not crying because she's depressed. She's crying because she feels less alone in this awful situation. And the phone was like dead. I thought, oh, he hung up on me. And I said, "Are you there?" He said, "I pulled over to the side of the road and I'm writing down exactly what you said." And then a few weeks later, I met him in his big office, and it skipped my mind. So I didn't ask him about his mom, but towards the end of our talk together, he looked at me and he said, "By the way, we talked about my mom and I did exactly what you told me to do. And she responded exactly the way you said she would." And he's a shy guy, and he stood up and he shook my hand with two hands, and he looked in my eyes. He was a little bit emotional. He said, "Thank you for that." And so that's an example of how to listen to people from where they're at. And sometimes what I do in these interviews is I try to demonstrate it with the person who's interviewing me, namely you. So if I were to listen to you versus listening into you, if I were to listen to you, you're teeing up great questions. You're giving me the chance to tell a story. Uh, you'll probably ask me some questions where I can give some good content. And that's listening to you. That's being responsive to your questions. But if I listen into you, and tell me if this feels different, Meredith, I hope it will. But if I'm listening into you, what I'm picking up is that it's really, really important for you to give good information to your listeners. I mean, they trust you to make their lives better, and you really feel duty bound. It's a calling for you, and it's really, and you're always looking for something that they can immediately use that will make their lives better, help them be more successful. And you're also probably on the lookout for so-called experts who really violate the traffic light rule in spades, and you're thinking to yourself, this person might be famous, but I can't publish this. I mean, I can't do this to my audience. I mean, I don't care what they wrote. This is terrible. And so I think you're very protective of the trust that people have in you, and you're always looking for that special interview that you know will change their lives. And is any of that accurate?
Well, yes, it is accurate that I want to deliver valuable information. I am very conscientious, but I'm also discriminating. So I haven't had an interview yet with someone that I thought, oh, I can't publish this, because, I've had a conversation with them in advance. And I can tell if someone is going to be, like you're saying, dominant, and I would never even bring it up as a suggestion to include them.
Sure.
I'm really looking for people like you, Mark, that really care about improving the lives of others. And it's one of the reasons your book resonated with me, because I can sense that throughout the book, that your commitment. And so there's an alignment in our values in what you're attempting to do through your work, and I think achieving it extremely well, and what you're really empowering other people to do. And that's why I was so excited about talking to you, because I know how important your message is. And even though I had heard that story with John, when you told it just now about the CEO and his mother, imagining that situation with that family and what a difference you made for them because of your willingness to really listen in to him and lean in to what he was going through and sense what he needed, even though initially he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. And I think that that's so critical. And in fact, it ties in with one of the things I wanted to go into with you from your book. In the first chapters, you talked about the brain, and I loved the way you kept it in very simple conversational terms, so it's easy to grasp, even though it's a very complex subject. But you introduced a term that I had not been familiar with, and probably some of the folks listening to this who haven't read your book would not be familiar with it. And it's this whole idea of mirror neurons. And you even use the term empathy neurons. And I would like for you to take a few minutes to talk about that, because it really is a theme throughout your book. And maybe in conjunction with, after you describe that term, explain the mirror neuron deficit or receptor deficit that many of us are walking around with, and how that all ties into listening.
I'll be happy to. So mirror neurons, I believe, were discovered in the late 1980s in macaque monkeys. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And they were discovered to be responsible for imitation, because monkeys will imitate each other and imitate even primates making faces. You make a face at a monkey, it'll make a face back. And at first they were called monkey see, monkey do neurons. And then when they further examine them, they realized that they're also in human beings, and they were thought to be responsible or associated with imitation, learning, and empathy. And when they don't work or they're deficient, they seem to contribute to autism. So people who are autistic cannot mirror other people. They don't pick up social cues. And in my many, many years of experience, what that resonated with was something that I came up with in the most recent printing of Just Listen. It's called the Mirror-Neuron Gap. And I changed the word from mirror neuron receptor deficit to mirror neuron gap.
Oh, that's simpler.
Because I wasn't mirroring people. When people saw, what's this mirror neuron receptor deficit? Whoa, that's a mouthful, but mirror neuron gap, everyone gets. So, and so the key is, and see what's interesting is it actually just worked with you. When I said mirror neuron gap, you smiled and you leaned in and you said, oh, that's simpler. I can get that. I could probably describe it now, mirror neuron gap. It's much easier. So that's an example of how mirror neurons work. And what I realized is that there's a lot of people who often feel that they're conforming to the emotional, psychological needs of the world and other people. And there is an ache for the world to basically care about you. Now, there's some people who are scorekeepers and they do it in a way that I'm not particularly fond of. I'm not a scorekeeper. But if you're someone who seems to care about people emotionally, psychologically, and you can tune into that and then you address it, when people aren't doing it to you, it creates a gap. It creates agitation. It increases, and this is new that wasn't in the book, it increases cortisol, which is the stress hormone. But when people do mirror you, it increases oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. And oxytocin, it basically can overcome cortisol. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone. So, for example, a good friend of mine and someone you probably know of, everyone knows about him, is Marshall Goldsmith, one of the executive coaches. And probably his best book that he's most famous for is What Got You Here Won't Get You There.
Yes, my favorite.
It's a great read. I would recommend it to anyone and everyone. But what he talks about are egregious behaviors, and his whole idea is you may be technically competent to get where you are now in your career, but unless you find a way to work through people and with people, you're not going to get the best results. So what got you here won't get you there. And he describes a whole bunch of behaviors that widen the mirror neuron gap. So when someone's a know-it-all, when someone talks down to you, when someone says yes, but when someone has to show off, all those things widen the gap. But just like there are things widening the gap, there's ways to narrow it. So in Just Listen, for instance, what I talk about is the 4 levels of talking and the 4 levels of listening. And so, for instance, the 4 levels of talking, which narrow the gap, the worst kind of talking is to talk over people. To talk over them, and you can tell you're talking over them, although you probably wouldn't notice it if you're a bit narcissistic, is because they get fidgety. They feel insulted. You know, it's like you're not even considering them as a person. You're seeing them sounding board. So that's talking over people. When you're talking at people, it's as if you're putting your finger in their face and you're warning them, and their body language for that is they'll, if they're intimidated by you, they'll look down like this, and, you know, don't hurt me, or they'll stick their chin up like this and say, you can't talk to me that way. So that's how you can tell whether you're talking at someone. If you're talking to someone, they nod from the neck up. Yeah, that makes sense. And that's sort of business as usual. But the gold standard is when you're talking with people. Even the word with takes your breath away. And when you're talking with people, they kind of, you can see they relax their neck and their head and they lean into it because they want more of that, because many people feel alone in the world. And those 4 levels of talking correspond to the 4 levels of listening. So when you're talking over people, that's what we call removed listening. That means you're removed from the conversation, but you're still talking. Talking at people, that responds to a reactive listening. So when someone's talking at you, you're reactive. When someone talks to you, what that triggers is responsible listening. You're giving them information, they're nodding, yes, that makes sense. But when you talk with people, that triggers receptive listening. And that means they're leaning in to get more of that. And I give talks all around the world on listening, and I talk about the mirror-neuron gap. And so one of the things that really grabs people's attention is I say the mirror-neuron gap is what's going on in tear-jerker movies. So for, you know, probably older generations, especially men, may know the movie Field of Dreams. So in the movie Field of Dreams, at the end, there's a scene in which Kevin Costner reaches out to his dad, who's played by a character, and he says, "Want to have a catch?" And there's not, if for guys who are probably over 40 who have seen the movie, there's not a dry eye in the audience. And what happens is the mirror-neuron gap has closed because, you know, we identify with the conflict between characters, and then when it's resolved, we all just start to cry with relief. For women, the movie that I talk about is As Good as It Gets, and one of my favorite scenes there is there's a scene between Helen Hunt and Jack Nicholson, where Jack Nicholson is saying to Helen Hunt, "I have a compliment for you." And Helen Hunt looks kind of like, "What's this about?" And he says, "Yeah, I've started taking medicines for this condition I have." And, you know, Jack Nicholson is like this. And I hate medicines. I mean, I hate medicines. But since I've met you, I'm taking medicines. And Helen Hunt, you know, has that puzzled look in her face. She says, "I don't understand how this is a compliment." And then Jack Nicholson is kind of like, "Well, and then he looks at her and he says, "You make me want to be a better man." And then the camera zooms in on Helen Hunt. Her eyes water. You can catch this on YouTube. She pauses and she says, "I think that's maybe the best thing I've ever heard in my life." So that's a great example of a tearjerker scene and eliminating a mirror-neuron gap. For those people who are younger and say, "I can't relate to these old baby boomer movies," check out Silver Lining Playbook, where at the end, Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper, you know, they're kind of crazy, neurotic people who keep missing each other. And at the end, they finally connect. And you'll see it's you know, it's a little bit of a chick flick, but I think it exemplifies the fact.
So when you think about in real life, in a situation at home or at work, what are some ideas that you have for people to become tuned into the power of these mirror neurons in a relationship? How can it be used in a positive way to build a stronger relationship with someone? And how could it be used to at least maybe tune into where another person is? Because I think in general, Mark, tell me if you agree with this, we're all preoccupied with ourselves and, you know, what's happening to us and where we are. And it takes a level of self-awareness as well as awareness of the people around us to pay attention to what they're experiencing, the little things that we can notice. So can you give some stories or examples that would show how an everyday person in an everyday situation might be able to utilize what you were just talking about?
Well, I'll give you something that's a little bit business related, and then I'll give you a tip that's that's new in the last 9 months that you can use anywhere.
Oh, great.
So what's business related? There's a company, I work with a number of companies, and I'm the chief mentor at a company called China Foundations, chinafoundations.com. And they're in Shanghai and Beijing. And all they do is they help cooperation and collaboration between Chinese workers and foreign expats. So what'll happen is Fortune 500 companies will bring in 800 to 1,000 managers. They'll build towns and schools, and then they'll outsource the cooperation and collaboration piece to China Foundations. And so in our work together, it's about how do you cross cultures, how do you cross silos, how do you cross generations, how do you cross genders? And we actually came up with a one-size-fits-all way of crossing any of those. And it's what we call anticipatory preemptive humility. I know I need to do the mirror-neuron gap on that one. But you'll like it. Anticipatory preemptive humility. And what that means, and imagine this, let's say you start to work with someone who's a different generation, different culture, different gender. And what you say to them, if it looks like you're going to be working together, is you look at them and say, if this continues, we're going to be spending a lot of time with each other. And we're going to develop a relationship. And going forward, one of the last things I would ever want to do is embarrass you in front of your people. So if you will tell me what I must always do going forward and what I must never do, so that I never embarrass you in front of your people, so that after a conversation, you have to explain who's the jerk from America that you brought into the company. It would be my pleasure to make sure that I always do what you tell me and I never do the things I shouldn't do. And that is so powerful because nobody does that. What you're doing is you're looking into the future, you're anticipating that there will be bumps. And so that's the anticipatory preemptive, and you're bearing your neck, and that's the humility. But can you see how powerful that would be?
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're in the dating world, I mean, what you can say to someone is you can say, going forward, both of us, we're divorced, both of us have had bad relationships, but going forward, tell me something I must always do and something I must never do, so that I remind you of some awful relationships you've had. Because going forward, the last thing I want to do is, trigger you or reactivate or traumatize you. So what might some of those things be? And the other person will weigh in. And then if you want to really turn this conversation into going deeper and getting to know them, you look into their eyes and you say, why those negative things should I avoid? And why should I do those positive things? What was the effect of those on you? And you're inviting the other person to say, well, those positive things can make me really feel special. And those negative things, I mean, they made me feel so awful. And as the other person is sharing those things, and if you actually like them, it'll increase your commitment. So as they share a story, which makes it real, you can look them in the eye and say, thank you. I'm going to do my best to make sure that I, focus on those positive things and not take you for granted. And I'm going to do my best to not do those negative things to you. So can you see that as a tip you can use anywhere?
Yes, and it ties back into what you were saying earlier with listening, to someone and then listening in to someone, because it's one thing to ask that question, what's one thing to do and not do, but it's another to probe deeper, to really understand why. Because to me, when you do that, you're demonstrating to that person, I really want to understand you. I want to get you. I don't want just facts or information. I really want to get at the heart of who you are. And I think that's so critical. It reminds me of one of the questions I had for you from one of the chapters. I was trying to remember now. Oh, it was this idea of asking a question of someone, going from transaction to transformation. That was the chapter. And you actually shared a story about your daughter, I think, when she went for a job interview. So that's another practical example I'd like you to share of that, coming up with a question that will cause the other person to pause and think, because nobody's ever presented them with a question like that before.
Absolutely. So my daughter is in New York, and she called me and she said she was going to have an informal, not in an office, but she's going to have an informal meeting with some high up manager at a financial company. So financial companies often tend to be transactional. And she said, you come up with these things. Is there something that I can do to make it sort of a different conversation? And I said, you don't do this right out of the gate, but if he says, do you have any questions, which a lot of times the other person will say, if you pause and say to him, I have a hypothetical question, if that would be okay, and hopefully he'll say yes, and say to him, I'd like you to imagine that this position that you were talking about, that you hire someone for that position, and a year from now, when your bosses are reviewing your decisions, and they review the person that you hired or suggested the company bring in, when they're reviewing that a year from now, they say to you, bring in 3 more people like that, and you're looking at a promotion and a raise. And what you're also looking to prevent is they're saying to you, when you brought in that person, what were you thinking? I mean, that person has been awful, and now it's caused us so much problem in getting rid of them. So can you describe what those 2 different people look like? What would be the kind of person that if you brought in, your bosses would say, wow, and the kind of person where if you brought in a person that was really negative, they'd say, yuck, what were you thinking? And he looked at her, and he looked up at the ceiling, and then he looked back at her and he said, you know, those are really good questions, and I don't have an answer, but I'm going to think about that. But can you see how that turned the conversation from transactional to, I guess, not transformational, but something that was more transcendent, and that's going to, and I believe that made my daughter more memorable than the usual conversations this guy probably has.
Yes. And, you know, that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from a book you're familiar with, The Prosperous Coach, where they talk about, before you have a conversation, to ask yourself, how can I serve this person so powerfully that they never forget our conversation for the rest of their life? And that involves asking them questions and getting them to think about things that maybe they haven't thought of before. I think that's a perfect example of that. It's not talking about yourself. It ties back into that stoplight. You know, if you're going on and on about yourself, that is not memorable for the other person. But to be so tuned into them that they come away from that conversation feeling they were understood and this person really got me, because it happens so rarely. I think that really is huge. The example you were giving about the China Foundation reminded me of another story you had told. It may have even been in the same chapter, about a new employee asking, what could happen with her potential new boss in terms of just an everyday transactional conversation versus her posing to him a similar question to what you were coaching your daughter on. And that was, I'm trying to remember exactly how it went, but, you know, at the end of my first year with you, or 90 days or whatever, what 3 things do you want me to always do? What 3 things do you want me to never do? And the difference in that kind of dynamic and exchange versus just the more superficial, everyday kind of things that people say to each other.
Well, if you think about it, that's so helpful, because when you don't have that conversation, your boss has experienced things that drove him or her crazy.
Yes.
And they may not bring it out. They're just hoping you'll be different than that other person. But the point is, those are such charged things in their mind that if you do that thing that drives them crazy, and you didn't know it would drive them crazy, not only do you have to pay the price of it annoying them now, you're actually triggering flashbacks.
Yes.
In fact, here's a segue to another tip. And actually, I did this recently with someone who had a boss who could be a bit of a bully and arrogant and condescending. And so what I had coached this woman to do with a boss who was like that is to stand up to him and say this. And it's, again, I'm really into this bearing your neck. So this is called assertive humility. So I come up, assertive vulnerability. I come up with these cute little terms that people can feel. So this is assertive humility. So what she said to him is, I need your help with something. But she didn't whine about it. I need your help with something. She was assertive. And he said, what? He said, and then she said, She said, I've discovered a way in which I'm getting worse results than I could get, and a way in which I could get better results for you. Because let's face it, you and I are judged on our results. So he's listening. You'll get someone's attention when you talk about results. And he looked, and she said, whether you know it or not, everybody triggers flashbacks in everybody else. And those flashbacks have a powerful effect on people. In the psychology world, we call that transference or countertransference, but everybody understands flashbacks. They don't understand transference because that's gobbledygook. But and she said to him, she said, what you may want to be aware of is that you trigger in me, and I think other people, negative flashbacks. You trigger flashbacks and reminders to people, maybe of people who talked down to them, made them feel worse. And what you need to be aware of is that when you trigger negative flashbacks, whoever you're triggering it in has to work around that. They're immediately distracted. And it takes energy to get back on track, and there's a good chance that they will miss the essence of what you're saying because they're so busy trying to sort of manage their upset feeling, and you remind people of that. Now, what I tell people, what I suggest is, since you always trigger flashbacks in life, you want to trigger positive flashbacks. So I coach all kinds of people and mentor all kinds of people, but I do it more with women than men. And the reason for that is women are more open to help. Men won't ask for directions. It's just the way it is. And I ask women, I say, why do you hire me? Why don't you hire women? And a number of them say, you're like the big brother I always wanted. And I say, what is that? So I'm triggering some flashback. And they said, well, a big brother I always wanted is someone who's smart, playful, irreverent, not stodgy. But you could take me to the woodshed and say to me, what the heck are you doing that for? And not only will I not be offended, I love the protective quality, and you say it and it's laced with love. And so you trigger a flashback of the big brother I always wanted. And so when I've given talks, and on more than a few occasions, I've spoken at women's conferences where I'm the only male speaker. And so what I suggest to those women in the audience, first of all, I'll ask them, have any of you ever had a big brother like that? Raise your hand. And when they raise their hand, they're smiling because they're reliving that big brother. And my instruction to those women is, be the big sister that everybody always wanted. Because the big sister is like that big brother. You know, you're committed, you're warm, but you're direct, you're protective, you're no nonsense. And so if you want to get ahead in the world as a woman, make that your identity. Because a lot of women have problems now with, should I lean in? Should I lean out? Should I act like a man? Should I act feminine? And a lot of them just don't have an identity. And a number of people came up to me and said, that's a perfect identity. Be that big sister that everybody wanted. And when I coach women, you'll get a chuckle out of this. One of the homework assignments I give them is to watch Barbara Stanwyck movies from the 40s and 50s, because she was exactly that way to Gary Cooper or Jimmy Stewart. I mean, she was this warm but tough, like big sister friend. It was perfect. I don't think she did it in her personal life. I think she was married 6 times, but she was a good actress. Don't watch Catherine.
No. So what happened with this client you were coaching on how to talk to her boss who was a bully?
Well, it got through, because here's another. I'm filled with all these little formulas. So hope people re-listen to this, or I've already screwed up my traffic light rule. So I have a formula called, which people might want to write down. And the formula is aggression plus principle equals conviction. Aggression minus principle equals hostility. So it's good to be aggressive in life. but you want to tie it to a principle or a mission that's not serving you, that's serving some goal.
Mm-hmm.
If you're aggressive without a principle or a mission, you become hostile. So conviction makes you strong. Hostility makes you wild. So what happens is if you can speak with, that's the assertive vulnerability. And one of my favorite stories is an example of aggression plus principle equals conviction. In 1995, I was doing a workshop in Dallas for an international convention for a real estate company. And one of the keynote speakers was Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, and he was being considered for president. And there were 10,000 people in the Dallas auditorium, and he gave this stirring, inspiring, just wonderful speech. And so they asked for questions. So imagine this, 10,000 people really just inspired by him. And one person in the audience says, "Excuse me, General Powell, your wife was depressed. I think she had shock treatment, went into a psychiatric hospital. You want to comment on that?" So the whole auditorium just went, oh, who is this idiot? And I thought to myself, what's he going to do? He's not going to cry like Edmund Muskie did about his wife. And people listening don't know who Edmund Muskie was, but he ran for president. Someone said something insulting about his wife. He started crying and he lost a lot of his credibility. Let's see, he might ignore the person. He might say something politically correct. Well, I think we need to, give parity to mental health issues as well as physical illness. And I thought, what's he going to do? So here's an example of aggression plus principle. So imagine hearing this. He pauses and he says, "Excuse me, sir. The person you love more than anyone in the world is living in hell, and you don't do everything you can to get them out. Do you have a problem with that, sir?" Can you feel the power of that?
Yes.
I mean, that's hairs on the back of your neck power.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so I think what happened is she was able to say that to her boss because, what she was basically saying is, it's up to you. You want me to get better results? Then trigger a positive flashback. If you want to get worse results, then be who you are, and everybody's going to work around that. It's up to you.
That is so true. And it reminded me, those last chapters in your book were all about dealing with difficult people, bullies being one of them. And I think you told me that the response you got from that really motivated you to write your next book. Is that part of what led to your most recent book?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those last chapters were actually scenarios. So I think the book reads pretty well. Just listen, and I didn't realize how important tone is, and I try to stay away from psychobabble because I think it's off-putting and it widens the mirror-neuron gap. I mean, it seems like eons ago that you and I discussed that. And so those last chapters are actual scenarios that people could see themselves in with actual approaches. But there were a couple chapters that got a lot of interest. There's one chapter called Steer Clear of Toxic People. So that's what do you do with these people that are just out and out toxic to your organization? And then there was another chapter earlier in the book called How to Go from OF to OK. And it's basically a way to calm yourself down when difficult people make you a little bit nuts. So that got so much attention that my most recent book called Talking to Crazy, How to Deal with the Irrational and Impossible People in Your Life, that's what that was about. And that's done well. That was a finalist in the Audible Oscar Awards. So if you like Audible books, it's not my voice, thankfully. But
I like your voice.
It's too nasal for me. Anyway, but it's a good listen. And it was featured on Oprah. So that's done very well. But I got to tell a funny story about not tuning into your audience. And so I talk about marketing tips. When I told my friends before I wrote the book, I'm going to write a book called Talking to Crazy, they all smiled. They all laughed. They said, "I need that book today." And I thought, oh, I'm onto something. Everybody said, "Oh, I love that title." So the book comes out, and the book's not doing that well, but the Kindle is. And I say to people, well, you said you needed the book. Why didn't you buy it? And they all look at me, and this was a real lesson in marketing. They said, it's like buying pornography. I can't let anyone see I'm reading the book. If I put it next to my bed table, next to my bed, my spouse will think it's about them, which it is. And if I have it on my desk as a manager and a subordinate comes in, they'll think it's about them, which it is. So I can't let anyone know that I'm reading that.
Oh no.
And so I said, look, if you got the hardcover of Just Listen, which is a very good book, take the flap off of Just Listen, put it on Talking to Crazy, because no one cares about a book that says Just Listen. We should, but nobody cares about it. So, but it was a real lesson in being able to think past, this immediate thing that people are smitten by and their behavior. So, I still like the title, and what's happened is it's grown in spite of itself, because I guess my platform and my books are getting better known. But
it's so funny, Mark. I have to tell you, I was telling someone, and I won't say who, about our upcoming interview and your most recent book. And the subtitle, how to deal with the irrational and impossible people in your life. I said, I think you may need this because you've got some family members that fit that. And she said, you are so right. She went out and bought it immediately. But it's that's such
and it caused a huge argument when they saw her reading it.
Well, fortunately, her husband is not crazy, and
okay.
so she can have it safely in her house with the book jacket intact and not worry about hiding it. But it's so true. There are these people in our lives that that aren't necessarily crazy, but they trigger whatever flashbacks, talking about what you were referring to earlier. They cause us to feel crazy at times because of how we feel when we interact with them. And so I think that it's a wonderful follow-up to the Just Listen book. You're right about the fact that a lot of people aren't interested in this thing of learning to listen. I don't know if they think it's boring or they already know how to do it, but there are so many subtleties to doing it well. I'm continuing to learn this with conversations that I have where what I think I'm doing is a normal thing, but it's not what most people do. Because when I really do listen well and the other person is responding, very positively, it's that whole going back to the mirror neurons, the feeling that somebody gets me because they are displaying to me an understanding of what I'm all about by either the questions they're asking, the willingness to, step back and understand my perspective and just take a genuine interest in doing something for me. I just think that's all wrapped up in listening. It's not sitting passively, just letting somebody talk and talk and talk. It's being actively engaged in what they're saying and responding to it in a way that I think helps them move from where they were at the beginning of the conversation to somewhere else that's good at the end of it.
Well, here's a keeper that has evolved, since these books. And I think I did cover it somewhat in Talking to Crazy, but I don't believe I covered it in Just Listen. So if you're going to read my books, Just Listen, there's actually three books that all fit together. So after I wrote Just Listen, my next book was Real Influence, Persuade Without Pushing, Gain Without Giving In. And that's an excellent book. I wrote it with John Ullman, an instructor at the Anderson School. Didn't do quite as well. And I think part of it is I didn't realize that, but people like tone. And that the tone of Real Influence is very good, but it feels academic. And I think that I'm in conversation with people, and I think my books come off this way, is people actually feel like I'm talking with them.
Yes.
And I didn't realize the power of that. I just thought I was being neurotic and I couldn't hide it. But here's a keeper, and people may actually just go to the end of this to hear this. So I won't keep you waiting with bated breath. There's something, here's another term, I'd like a better term. There's something called mediated catharsis. And what that means is when you can give another person permission and direct them to tell you the negative things they're feeling about you that are much worse than what they would normally say, it gets it off their chest safely. So the way this would look like, let's say there's two ways of processing information in the world. One is there are people who hear something and they think and then they do, and they don't like to feel. Those are analytical types, more traditionally male, but some women do that. And then there are others who, when they hear something, they like to feel and they do, but they don't like to think. But they have good instincts. In fact, someone who's a feel doer, a creative who has great instincts, I'll match great instincts against big data anytime. So one's not superior to the other, but people who are feel do and people who are think do really lock horns. So the way mediated catharsis looks like, and I'll share one, there's a woman I know who's a feel do, and she said, my husband and I have these issues. He's an engineer. He's very smart. He's very thoughtful. People think he's a little bit stiff, whereas I am kind of bubbly. I do blither, drives my husband crazy, but people like me. I mean, people like me even if I blither. But when I get into these discussions with my husband, and I begin to blither or get a little emotional, he gets stiff like this. He hides in his engineering mindset. I said, so I gave her a directive, and this is what mediated catharsis looks like. And we'll call her Joan and call him Joe. And I said, Joan, next time you're with Joe and it's escalating, at some point, but you have to have the presence of mind to know it's escalating and that you don't want it to. At some point you say, Joe, in exactly this tone, Joe, I think I have a way out of this. Play along with me. Now, if you say that, Joe's happy. Oh, it's over. Let's go eat. Let's go have a drink. For him, he's glad that it stopped. But you take it a step further and he'll go, what? You could say, yeah, I think I have a way that'll make this much better. Play along with me. And then I told her to say to Joe and look him straight in the eye, which you're able to do. You're able to look someone in the eye when it's about them or a mission. And she said, Joe, say this to me. Joan, when we get into a conversation and you start to get emotional, you start to raise your voice, it makes me crazy. It makes me want to pull my hair out. I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. If I say something, it's wrong. If I don't say something, it's wrong. And you make me crazy. And he says, what? And she said, I said, coach him. Help him get it out. And the point is, you won't be defensive because you're mediating the catharsis. So 3 days later, I said, what happened? She said, I got good news and bad news. I said, what's the good news? She said, well, I did that and he got stiff. And like you said, I coached him. I said, just lean into the words. And he said, when you do that, it makes me crazy. And she said, come on, lean into it more. I think you can get into this. And she said, after about 6 or 7 minutes, he would get flinging stuff at me. This stuff was 10 years old, and he's having a good old time. And I'm not being defensive because I see he's getting it off his chest. And I said, well, what's the bad news? And she said, after he did that, he hasn't stopped telling me how much he adores me, and how I'm his best friend. And he's saying, oh, I love you. He's creeping me out. I said, don't worry. You'll slip backwards. It'll be okay. But can you see the power of mediating catharsis? So that's so I'm a lifelong learner. So if people follow me, and we're probably coming close to the end of this, they'll find my most current ranting and raving.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next. I love that story. It's so powerful because we do escalate things because we get our egos involved. We take it personally. We get upset with the other person instead of stopping and encouraging them to give us more of what is pent up anyway. I just love that. But yes, that was the thing. In wrapping up, I wanted to, have you tell people where they can get your your books and where they can also get more of you and connect with you.
Okay, so I'll just list off a bunch of them, and I'm about to get someone's going to Skype call me any minute, so I'll hope it doesn't distract here. But if you follow me at Twitter at Mark Goulston, and I'm beginning to be like Trump. I mean, I have 430,000 followers, and I am irreverent, but I'm respectful. But my humor comes out. So if you at Mark Goulston, I don't know that I'll respond because I have too many followers. I have several websites. One is markgoulston.com. That's my speaking, markgoulston.com. I have a consulting and training company called goulstongroup.com. I am the co-founder of something called Heartfelt Leadership, spelled heartfeltleadership.com, and I have a wonderful co-founder, Deb Bolkus, and if you go there, it looks like a Google page, and it says Daring to Care. If you're looking for a better way, enter here. And we have amazing videos with just inspirational, heartfelt leaders. I'm going to be also working with Working Nation. Working Nation is actually founded by a venture capitalist, and it's focused on all the displaced, unemployed people who are not going to go back to work soon. So they're the ones who are displaced by technology, and I'm one of their key people providing articles about how to deal with unemployment, how to deal with discouragement, how to keep your spirits up. So that's another thing I'm being part of. And then the final thing is I'm about to start doing my own weekly podcast called Prison Letters with Mark Goulston, because my first book, Get Out of Your Own Way, is 20 years old, and it's found its way into prisons and jails. I've gotten over 150 letters from inmates, and so the podcast will be me reading those letters and giving advice, sort of like Dear Abby, and that'll start in the near future. So I am kind of, I'm fairly productive for someone with ADD, don't you think?
Amazingly so. I love it. Thank you for sharing all those different locations. And of course, I want to recommend people to get your book. Just Listen. You said there's a newer edition where
Yes.
you use Mirror-Neuron Gap instead of the receptor deficit. I do like the simplicity of that. And then I don't have your newer book, but Talking to Crazy is an easy title to remember. So
yeah, well, I don't even have the cover here. Wait a second. Let me see if I can grab the cover. That's
okay.
Well, there you go. Anyway, you can find it. So
we will. Thank you, Mark. It has been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and thank you for all the great tips that you gave. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Hopefully there's a pony in there somewhere.
There's lots of ponies. Thank you.
Okay. Until the next time.
All righty.
Thank you all.